So Canada just snubbed its best friend, America. The question now is, what happens next? And there are some clues how this will unfold in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. It began on Saturday, August 22nd, when the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, announced that Canada was walking away from important trade talks with the United States. Now, to some, this seemed reckless. To some, brave. Whatever one's perspective, what it wasn't was unpredictable. For those watching closely, it was entirely foreseen. There were strong indications a month earlier this was going to happen. Now, as someone who taught economic geography at a Canadian university, I'll get into what's likely to come out of all of this. But before we get to that, let's go back to those clues that were flashing red a month ago. On July 20th, the US President Donald Trump announced he was going to impose 50% tariffs on a number of Canadian goods. Now, for a weaker partner, a dependent partner, a vassal state that some believe Canada to be, this should have caused utter turmoil. But that's not what happened. The Canadian dollar went up after Trump's announcement and never stopped rising, gaining over 2% in only 4 weeks. The market signaled that something entirely different was going on. At the macro level, it was pretty clear what that was. Canada was not only stronger than she appeared, but she was using that strength to divorce America. Canada has in fact been remaking alliances, friendships, and gaining new trading partners over the last year. And this was not done behind the scenes. It wasn't hidden. In fact, the Prime Minister said it out loud and in writing. Back in May of 2026, at the Economic Club of New York, he stated, "The world has changed. Canada is focusing on what we can control, consolidating our forces at home, and diversifying our partnerships abroad." The reason Canada was taking this position at this time is because of something you've probably never heard about, but really should. And for that, I highly recommend you take a look at Jay Martin's video from 3 weeks ago titled, "America's Allies Are Building a Future Without It." I'll place the link below. But stay here now because I'm going to dive into the weird trade patterns inside Canada that tell us what's about to happen next. And the big message to keep in mind is that Canada is pulling away from the United States. And this is either going to lead to a great renaissance for Canada or a disastrous enslavement by an enraged divorcee. It all starts with size and how Canada trades. Canada is a big country, bigger than the United States in fact, which means Canada doesn't have a simple one-size-fits-all trading pattern. Canada doesn't sell one product to one customer like Botswana, who exports diamonds and not much else. And it doesn't have a diverse export economy that's contained in a tight geographic area like Belgium. In fact, it's impossible to talk about Canada as a single unit. No two of its 10 provinces and 3 territories are alike. Pointing out that Canada sends 72% of its exports, on average, to the United States is a meaningless statistic. Even worse, some people will say that each province trades more with the US than it does with the rest of Canada, so it should just become the 51st state. This is a very, very lazy analysis. The reality is far more interesting and consequential. And as they say, the devil is in the details, and therein are found lies, damn lies, and statistics. So I'm going to chart the path that allows us to understand where Canada is heading. And that requires taking a look at 4 trading patterns as old as time itself. And by the end of this video, once you understand them, you'll see why Canada holds serious leverage over the United States and is not the dependent little brother to the mighty America that some believe she is. Now, this is not to say Canada doesn't have an Achilles heel. She does, and I'll get to that. But the first of those trading patterns we can simply call mutual trade. That sounds really obvious, but most people completely miss the underlying premise here. Mutual trade only happens between 2 or more neighboring regions that are different. Geography and climate play a big role. Different geography means different products. Coastal regions, for example, will have things like fish. Inland regions might have grains, and mountainous regions maybe have timber and hydropower. The point is that trade between dissimilar regions is almost always mutually beneficial. So let's use Europe from the 1100s to the 1500s as an example. So trade typically involved timber and fur from Russia that moved west, fish and grains from Scandinavia that moved south, linen from Flanders, tin from Cornwall, armory and luxury goods from Italy. And everyone would meet and trade their goods at market towns such as Antwerp, Bruges, and Lubeck. Now this was mutual trade. Everyone benefited, everyone wins. And as I said, this all seems obvious until we see the other three trading patterns. But for now, let's take the mutual trade concept to the western side of South America for a moment, where for thousands of years, cotton was grown at the coast and used for things like fishing nets and clothing. Up in the high valleys of the Andes, foods such as potatoes and tomatoes were grown. And on the other side of the Andes, in the upper reaches of the Amazon, were medicines and exotic goods, too abundant to list. Now, each of these three regions eagerly traded with one another. Again, they all benefited. Trade flowed east-west up and over the Andes between coast and Amazon. Okay, now let's bring that mutual trade concept up to North America. And what we find is that it replicates reliably only on the western side of the continent, just like South America. Only here do we find the huge differences in geography between coast, mountains, and the open plains that are needed for mutual trade to work smoothly. And it does. Historically, trade moved across the mountains, which meant it moved east-west, not north-south. Now, this was true in the past, and it's true today. British Columbia, for example, trades more goods east and west with Alberta and Asia than it does with Washington State to the south. So why? Well, because BC, Alberta, and Asia all have different things. BC and Washington have the same things. BC and Washington both have fish, they both have fruit, they both have timber, they both have wine. There's no point trading fruit for fruit, fish for fish, timber for timber, or wine for wine. So, BC and Washington both look east and west to sell their goods, not at each other. What's unusual, however, for British Columbia is that during the brief period known as globalization from the end of World War II until now, BC's trade appeared to shift southward and rose to a high of 54% with the United States. It was weird, but the reason is simple. A couple industries skewed the statistics, namely forestry and energy. These industries made it appear that BC was dependent on the United States for most of its trade. It is not. And the thing is, as globalization winds down, the original natural trade pattern is quickly reasserting itself. In the last 3 years alone, trade exports to the US have dropped from 54% down to 50% and are continuing to decline. Forestry, for example, was always fickle and it's losing importance, while natural gas is shifting to Asia upon the opening of a new port at Kitimat 2 years ago. In fact, if we jump ahead in time and exclude forestry and energy entirely from the equation, BC's export trade to the US would be under 20%, a number that gives BC plenty of breathing room to pretty much disregard most of what happens south of the border. But BC is not alone in this. On the other coast, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador are the same. They're mostly indifferent to the US because their trade pattern is mostly mutual with the rest of the world, not with America. Now, I know some of you are going to yell at me over this and say I'm insensitive to jobs in forestry and blah, blah, blah. Well, put it in the comments below. I need to go on to the real doozy, the second trade pattern, plunder. Now, plunder happens when neighboring regions are the same. Because they're the same, they don't have anything to trade with one another. So, you would think they would just leave each other alone, right? Well, wrong. The problem is that when things go badly, like during a widespread drought, they all suffer at the same time. And since everyone is suffering, it doesn't take long for one of the regions to come up with the bright idea of saying, hey, we don't have enough this year, and even though the neighboring people don't have enough to survive this year either, they will still have something, so let's go get it from them. One of us has to live, right? And it might as well be us. So they plunder. Now, it's a form of trade, it's just not a mutually beneficial form. And this pattern is more common than you might think. But once you see it everywhere. The Yucatan Peninsula is a good historical example. During the Mayan period, city-states fought one another constantly. not because they hated each other, but because they had the same misfortune of all living on the same flat, humid landscape that suffered periodic drought conditions at the same time. Now, this actually happened a lot, and so the only way to overcome it was to become the fiercest city-state that could raid, steal, and plunder from other city-states. But, of course, with everyone vying for that title of being the most brutal, the most fearsome, well, things got pretty gruesome. But the Mayans weren't a one-off. Plunder is everywhere, even today. Cambodia and Thailand, Russia and Ukraine, or historically the Poles and Germans, French and Germans, Blackfoot and Shoshone, Huron and Iroquois. On Canada's west coast, it was Cowichan and Haida, Kwantlen and Squamish. Same geography, same commodity, fish. So they didn't bother trading with one another. They fought, they plundered, they murdered. Now, luckily in modern Canada, we don't have overt plunder economies between regions anymore, per se. And that has come about partly because political unification allowed us to do something different. Now, in many places, we went with a third type of trade pattern, a trade pattern we can call united or common market. Now, this happens when two or more regions pool their resources together in order to increase efficiency, consolidate businesses, and scale up the entire economic system. Ironically, this often happens in places where the plunder system used to exist, but people got tired of that and agreed to come up with something new. The European coal and steel community, formed in 1951, is a really good example of this. The French and Germans had been notorious for killing each other, but after the Second World War, they got together, along with the Dutch, the Italians, Belgians, and the Luxembourgers, and said, hey, we have coal deposits all over the place. Instead of each of us having our own separate coal and steel industries that are really inefficient, why don't we just open things up, allow everyone to access coal wherever they need it, build the steel plants where it makes sense, and see what happens. And so that's what they did. And the European coal and steel industry took off to great success. Now, if we bring that united trade or common market concept over to North America, we see the corollary in the automotive industry. It used to be two separate industries, one inside Canada and one inside the United States. But it made much more sense to pool resources and have the raw materials, the labor, the capital, and the factories integrated across what is essentially the same basic geography. We call it Southern Ontario, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and so on, but it's basically all the same geography. And since the geography is the same, they said, hey, let's get rid of the political lines and let the market do its thing. Let it figure out where to build the factories, let labor and capital go where it's needed most. We can eliminate duplication and paperwork and let manufacturing create efficiencies of scale. So in 1965, the AutoPac Agreement was signed between Canada and the United States. And it worked pretty well ever since. But the Trump administration was elected on a platform of bringing jobs back to America. Now, it sounds good as an election platform, but if enacted in full against Canada, it would essentially force the automotive industry to return to the old system, essentially a return to two national auto industries, one in Canada, one in America. And it would work. It would actually work just fine. It just wouldn't be very efficient, and the cost of every automobile would go up dramatically. So it's probably not going to happen, and the pushback won't come from Canada. It will come from American business owners who would be affected by U.S. tariffs far more than anyone, which means we can now go to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and a little bit of Manitoba, where we have the last trade pattern I want to talk about, and perhaps the most unstable pattern that is bound to cause the most problems. And that's the trade pattern of dependency. Trade only goes one way, one seller, one buyer. If the seller has only one customer, they're dependent on that buyer, but if the buyer has only one supplier, they're dependent on that seller. As long as the relationship is neutral between buyer and seller, no problem. But the moment one side becomes more dependent on the other, or one side breaks away from the relationship, even in the smallest amount, the whole relationship starts to break down. And the problem here is that Alberta, specifically, is highly dependent on the US. Nearly 89% of its international exports go to America, worth over $150 billion a year, and most of it is related to oil. But the US is also outrageously dependent on oil from Alberta and, to a lesser extent, Saskatchewan. The US uses 20.6 million barrels of oil a day. It produces 13.8 million itself, so it has to import roughly 7 million to make up for the shortfall. Alberta supplies around 60% of that shortfall. Another way of phrasing that is 20 to 25% of all petroleum consumed in the US every day comes from Canada, mostly Alberta. For the United States, that's an extraordinary reliance on one supplier. And this is where Canada has both leverage and an Achilles heel. Twinning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the west coast gave Alberta some options. As of May 2024, she could sell a lot more of her oil to other markets such as Japan and China. She could also charge a higher price. In other words, the relationship between dependent seller and dependent buyer changed. And we can't be naive about the implications of this. The US has already shown that it won't tolerate allies shifting their trade to others if that trade might threaten the US. Now, this is not speculative. In 2022, the US blew up the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline between Germany and Russia, an energy pipeline Germany depended on to fuel its economy, but also a pipeline that allowed Russia to bring in significant revenues. It didn't matter that Germany was an ally of the US, it only mattered that Russia was the enemy, and Germany had become too cozy for America's liking. It's a lesson that Canada cannot ignore, especially with regard to China. Even though China is a natural trading partner for Canada, China has also become an enemy of the US. And America has been warning Canada for some time now, don't get too cozy with China, or else. It's a catch-22 for both Canada and the US. Both are dependent on one another, and where the rubber hits the road is in Alberta. Alberta is America's last stop gas station. Any rational observer can see the problem and the temptation. As the US loses its favored position with an important supplier, it will almost certainly try to do whatever it can to get that supplier back into a dependent relationship. So the most outrageous action to consider would be outright military annexation of Alberta. Now, I don't think that will happen. What is actually far more likely is an indirect attempt to gain that position. Different action, same result. The indirect method involves destabilizing Canada while inserting control over the business, political, and even the military elite. Now, this is already happening. The US has been propping up the Alberta separation movement through social media influence and some political meddling. Now, I am not saying that the Alberta separation movement isn't legitimate. It is, and it has support among many Albertans who desire separation from Canada for various reasons. What's being said here is that the US is simply trying to amplify that support, and we can expect a lot more of that soft meddling in the future. The ultimate goal of the US? Well, get Alberta to separate from Canada on its own accord, at which time America can lull her into the American Union voluntarily without any shots being fired. Oil secured, case closed. Which brings us all the way back around to the very beginning of all of this. When Mark Carney walked away from trade talks, he exposed the lie that Canada is weak. But he also set the stage for a turbulent future. And that turbulence will be felt unevenly. The coastal provinces are mostly indifferent to what's going on, aside from really specific industries. But otherwise, meh. Central Canada may feel threatened with tariffs, but any tariff action by the US would hurt them as much, if not more, than Canada. So the likely outcome, no real change for Central Canada. The reality is that things are not going to heat up over autos or furniture or milk, but over oil. Alberta and Saskatchewan will be the battleground. So we're at a place now where, even though formal trade talks have broken down, places like Oshawa, Ingersoll and Cambridge, Ladysmith and Bridgewater, Cache Creek, Sherbrooke and Ladner, they can all just relax. It's the prairie provinces that will be heating up. And on that note, before you go, buy my book, Running Away from Stalin, story of a man who lived under Stalin and Hitler before finding freedom in Canada as a professor of economic geography. It's a returning home story set in a time of fascism, communism, and freedom. Link is below. Okay, bye for now.